The smoke rising from 6 wooden-cased chimneys made Niels Thorson's cabin look like a frontier factory, and every trapper within 20 miles predicted he would burn alive before winter ended. But when Bjorn Carlson's meat spoiled in his overheated cabin, while Niels pulled perfectly cured elk from his smoke-filled interior, the mockery stopped. Before we see how one Norwegian trapper's grief turned into the most ridiculed, then most copied innovation in the northern Rockies, let us know where you're watching from, and if Frontier Survival Stories move you, hit subscribe. The year was 1841. The Rocky Mountain fur trade was in its final golden decade, and men willing to risk everything could still make a fortune trapping beaver along the tributaries of the Yellowstone River. Niels Thorson had survived 8 winters in the Montana wilderness, and he knew the rhythms of survival as well as any man alive. His partner, Rolf Johansson, had joined him 4 years earlier, and together they worked a profitable territory near the confluence of 2 unnamed creeks in what would later become southwestern Montana. Their cabin was unremarkable. 4 days of work had produced a structure identical to dozens of others scattered across the territory. Logs notched at the corners, mud and moss chinked between gaps, a single stone chimney built from river rocks and clay. 1 door, 1 small window, and a dirt floor. It kept out wind and rain. It provided shelter during the brutal winters when temperatures dropped to 30 below zero. That was enough, or so every trapper believed. The problem every mountain man faced was meat preservation. A successful hunting season could yield hundreds of pounds of venison, elk, and bear meat, but without proper preservation, it would spoil within weeks. The standard solution involved smoking the meat in a separate structure, a dedicated smokehouse built 20 or 30 yards from the living cabin. This required constant attention. Fires had to be maintained at precise temperatures, low enough to produce smoke without cooking the meat, hot enough to generate consistent output. A trapper might spend 4 or 5 hours each day managing his smokehouse, time stolen from setting trap lines or processing pelts. The alternative was smoking meat inside the living cabin, but this created its own problems. The fire needed for smoking had to burn low and slow, producing thick smoke but minimal heat. In winter, this left the cabin freezing. A man could cure his meat or heat his home, but doing both simultaneously seemed impossible. Every trapper accepted this limitation. You managed 2 structures, or you froze while smoking, or you smoked in autumn and hoped the preserved meat lasted through winter. Niels and Rolf had followed the standard approach. Their small smokehouse stood 30 yards from the cabin, a crude structure of green logs that would last 2 or 3 seasons before needing replacement. During the autumn of 1841, they processed deer and elk, hanging strips of meat on racks inside the smokehouse while tending fires of green willow that produced dense, cool smoke. It was tedious work, but it was the work of survival. By early April, their meat stores were adequate. Not abundant, but sufficient to supplement spring trapping with protein. They had emerged from another winter successfully. Both men were already planning the next season, discussing which creek tributaries to focus on, where beaver populations seemed strongest. Everything was routine. Everything was fine. Neither man suspected that within 2 weeks one of them would be dead, and the other would begin an obsession that would change how cabins were built across the entire northern Rockies. April 14, 1841, began as an unremarkable spring morning. Rolf Johansson left the cabin at dawn to check their trap lines along the eastern creek, a route he had walked dozens of times. Niels stayed behind to process pelts from the previous day's haul, scraping fat and tissue from beaver hides stretched on wooden frames outside the cabin. The work was methodical, requiring attention but not concentration, and he lost himself in the rhythm of the draw knife against hide. Around midday, 3 gunshots cracked through the distance. Rapid succession, then silence. Niels dropped his knife and grabbed his rifle. 3 shots meant trouble. 1 shot was a kill. 2 shots suggested a miss and correction. 3 shots meant desperation. He ran toward the sound, following the creek eastward, his boots splashing through shallow water where the bank narrowed. He found Rolf a mile from camp, near a beaver dam they had been working for 2 weeks. The grizzly bear lay dead 15 feet from Rolf's body. The scene told its story with brutal clarity. Rolf had been checking a trap at the dam's edge when the bear attacked, probably a female protecting territory or drawn by the scent of trapped beaver. Rolf had managed to fire his rifle, but the shot had only wounded the animal. The enraged grizzly had killed him with terrible efficiency before succumbing to its own wound. Niels spent the rest of that day digging. The ground was partially frozen, and each shovelful came hard. He buried Rolf on a hillside overlooking the creek where they had trapped together, marking the grave with stones arranged in a careful rectangle. He spoke no words. There were no words that mattered. That night, alone in the cabin, Niels could not sleep. He kept hearing those 3 shots, each one a moment of hope followed by failure. The single room felt larger without Rolf's presence. The fire burned in the stone chimney, providing warmth, but Niels noticed things he had never paid attention to before. The gaps between logs where wind whistled through despite the chinking. The door that hung on leather hinges, secured only by a simple wooden bar. The single window covered with scraped hide that let in dim light and kept out nothing. Determined to enter, he thought about the bear. If Rolf had made it back to the cabin with the animal pursuing, what would have stopped it? The door would have lasted minutes against a determined grizzly. The walls were solid, but the gaps between logs could be widened by powerful claws. The window was an obvious weak point. The cabin offered shelter from weather, but against a real threat, it provided almost no protection. Most mountain men would have buried their partner and moved on, accepted death as part of the bargain made when entering the wilderness. But something shifted in Niels that night. He became fixated on a question that most trappers never asked. Why did cabins have to be so vulnerable? Niels finished the spring trapping season alone, but he spent his time differently than before. He visited other trappers' camps, ostensibly to trade supplies and share news of the season's take, but actually to observe how they lived. He paid attention to their cabins, their smokehouses, their daily routines of survival. A pattern emerged that he had never consciously noticed before. At Torsten Muller's camp, Niels watched the daily ritual. Torsten maintained his smokehouse 20 yards from his cabin, tending fires of green alder that produced the dense, cool smoke needed for proper meat curing. Every few hours he checked the temperature, adjusted the ventilation, added wood. Meanwhile, his cabin fire burned separately, providing heat for cooking and warmth. 2 structures, 2 fires, constant management of both. Torsten complained about the work. Half his day spent managing smoke, the other half staying warm. In deep winter, he said, he sometimes slept in his cabin with inadequate heat because he was too exhausted from smokehouse maintenance to properly tend both fires. At Axel Dagmar's camp, Niels learned about a different failure. Axel had tried smoking meat inside his cabin the previous autumn, thinking he could manage both heating and curing in one space. The experiment had failed spectacularly. When he built fires hot enough to keep the cabin comfortable, the temperature rose too high for proper curing, and the meat cooked rather than smoked. When he kept the fire low for correct smoking temperature, the cabin became unbearably cold. He had lost an entire month's worth of venison to spoilage before giving up and building a separate smokehouse. Bjorn Carlson had the most elaborate system Niels observed. 2 structures, carefully managed fires in each, a complicated routine of moving between them. Bjorn had refined his approach over 12 years of mountain living. It worked, but it required constant attention and considerable effort. Even Bjorn admitted that some winters he barely kept ahead of the workload. The question that began forming in Niels's mind was simple but apparently unanswerable. Why couldn't a cabin do both? Everyone accepted that heating and curing were incompatible in the same space. Hot fires for comfort, cool smoke for preservation. The two requirements seemed mutually exclusive, but Niels started thinking about waste. He watched smoke pour from Bjorn's chimney and disappear into cold air. That smoke carried heat, warmth generated by burning wood rising uselessly into the atmosphere. Meanwhile, Bjorn burned separate fires in his smokehouse, generating different smoke at different temperatures. The inefficiency seemed obvious once Niels paid attention to it. Heat escaped from chimneys, wasted, while men burned more wood elsewhere to generate more heat. What if that escaping heat could be captured? What if smoke could be routed through a structure in ways that served multiple purposes? The technical challenge seemed immense, but the basic question was sound. Could one fire, properly managed, provide both warmth and curing smoke? In June of 1841, Niels traveled to St. Louis to sell his spring furs. The journey took 3 weeks on horseback, following established trails east through mountain passes and across plains. Most trappers spent their St. Louis time in saloons and brothels, converting months of isolation into brief explosions of social excess. Niels spent his time studying buildings. He walked the streets examining construction techniques with the intensity of an apprentice, though he was 33 years old and had built a dozen cabins in his life. But he had always built them the way every trapper built them, following patterns learned from other men who had learned from others before them. Now he looked at structures with different eyes, searching for principles rather than copying methods. A warehouse near the riverfront caught his attention, double wall construction with a visible gap between inner and outer walls. He talked his way inside and found the foreman, a German carpenter named Heinz, who explained the concept. The air gap trapped warmth radiating from the inner wall, creating insulation that kept stored goods from freezing in winter. The principle was simple. Heat radiates in all directions, and if you capture it before it escapes, you multiply its usefulness. At a brewery, Niels observed a system of multiple chimneys serving different fermentation rooms. The brewmaster explained that different stages of fermentation required different temperatures, controlled by adjusting which flues drew air and which remained closed. By opening and closing dampers, they could create warm zones and cool zones within the same building, all heated by a single central furnace. The smoke and heat were routed through channels, directed purposefully rather than allowed to simply rise and escape. A brick kiln showed him another principle. The inner chamber, where bricks were fired at extreme temperatures, was surrounded by an outer protective shell. The shell never touched the inner chamber directly. It protected the interior from weather and wind, while also preventing the dangerous heat from radiating outward where it could start fires or injure workers. The gap between inner and outer structures served as both insulation and protection. Niels filled a small leather notebook with sketches, cross-sections of walls, diagrams of chimney systems, notes about air gaps and heat radiation. Other trappers saw him crouched beside buildings with his pencil and paper and shook their heads. Thorson had gone strange after his partner's death, they said, studying stoves like a professor instead of drinking like a man. He spent his profits on materials instead of entertainment, sheet metal that could be shaped, iron bands that could reinforce structures, specialized tools for shaping wood and stone. When he loaded these supplies onto pack horses for the return journey, other trappers openly mocked his purchases. But Niels had a plan forming, one that combined principles he had observed into something new. Gunnar Ekelund operated the main trading post serving trappers in the northern Montana Territory, a rough log structure that stocked everything from gunpowder to coffee to basic tools. He had seen mountain men make strange purchases before, but Niels Thorson's supply order in late July of 1841 made no sense whatsoever. 40 pounds of square cut nails. On the frontier, nails were expensive, transported hundreds of miles and priced accordingly. Most trappers used wooden pegs or simple joinery. Nails were a luxury reserved for doors or critical connections. 40 pounds suggested building something substantial, but trappers built quickly and simply. 6 heavy iron bands, each roughly 3 feet in diameter, purpose unknown. A roll of sheet metal, useless for trapping and heavy to transport. Clay and horsehair, both available free in the mountains if a man knew where to look. Specialized masonry tools, including a particular trowel design that Gunnar had to special order from St. Louis. Gunnar finally asked what any reasonable man would ask. "You building a fortress or a fancy city house?" Niels replied simply. "A cabin that works properly." Other trappers present in the trading post that day began speculating immediately. Thorsen had lost his mind after Johansen's death. Grief made men do strange things. He was wasting money on materials that served no purpose. He would come back next season having learned expensive lessons about frontier practicality. Lars Anderson, a traveling trader who moved between camps buying furs and selling supplies, made note of the purchases. He had known Niels for 5 years and had never seen him make impractical decisions. The Norwegian was methodical, careful with money, not given to waste. If he was buying strange materials, he had reasons. Lars filed the observation away, curious what would come of it. Niels loaded everything onto 3 pack horses, distributing weight carefully. The iron bands alone weighed nearly 80 pounds. The nails, metal sheets, and tools added another 60. He was carrying nearly 150 pounds of materials that most trappers would consider unnecessary, transported at considerable effort back into the mountains. Bjorn Karlsson encountered him on the trail 2 days later, both men heading back to their respective territories. Bjorn examined the loaded pack horses and laughed. "You carrying enough iron to shoe every horse in Montana. What's all that for?" Niels offered no detailed explanation. "Building a better cabin." Bjorn's assessment was immediate and certain. "Poor bastards building a monument to Johansen, waste of time and money, cabins for keeping rain off your head, not impressing anybody." He rode on, shaking his head at the foolishness of men who couldn't accept death and move forward. The story spread through the scattered trapping community over the following weeks. Thorsen had bought a fortune in unnecessary materials. He was building something elaborate, probably driven by grief. The consensus was sympathy mixed with certainty that he was wasting resources. Mountain living required practicality. Elaborate projects were city thinking, unsuited to wilderness realities. Niels ignored the talk. He had observed principles in St. Louis that could solve problems everyone else accepted as unsolvable. Whether others understood his reasoning was irrelevant. He would build what he envisioned, test whether it worked, and accept the results. If he failed, he would have wasted time and money. If he succeeded, he would survive winters more efficiently than anyone else in the territory. Niels returned to his trapping territory in early August of 1841 with his unusual supplies and a clear vision. His first decision surprised any trapper who might have observed. He did not rebuild on the site where he and Rolf had lived. That location was close to the creek, convenient for water, following standard practice. Niels selected new ground 50 yards uphill from the creek on a slight rise with clear sight lines in all directions. The location made daily life harder. Hauling water uphill was additional work. The site was more exposed to wind. But Niels had different priorities now. He wanted to see threats approaching. He wanted drainage if heavy rains created flooding. He wanted the cabin positioned defensively, not just conveniently. Rolf's death had taught him that comfort mattered less than survival. His first step was unusual for frontier cabin construction. He dug foundation trenches. Most trappers simply cleared ground and began stacking logs directly on dirt. Cabins settled unevenly. Gaps opened between logs. Structures required constant rechinking. Niels dug trenches 8 inches deep around the perimeter of his planned structure, then filled them with river stones, creating a level base that would prevent settling. This foundation work alone consumed a week. A traditional trapper cabin could be fully built in 4 days. Neil spent 7 days on foundation before raising a single log, but he worked with precision, checking level constantly, adjusting stones, until the base was perfectly flat. He knew that everything built on top would only be as stable as what lay beneath. The foundation revealed something else unusual. The interior was divided, not a simple rectangle like standard cabins, but with stone cross walls creating separate chambers. The layout resembled a grid, 6 distinct spaces at ground level, each roughly 2 feet square. To any observer, this would have made no sense. Living space was precious in small cabins. Why waste it on internal divisions? Bjorn Carlson visited in mid-August, curious despite his skepticism. He watched Niels placing stones with obsessive care, building interior walls that seemed to serve no purpose. "You could have built 3 cabins in the time you're spending on one," Bjorn observed. "What are those chambers for?" Niels continued working. "Fire chambers, each one separate." Bjorn stared at the layout. 6 chambers, 6 separate fires? The idea was absurd. 1 fire heated a cabin adequately. 6 fires would be wasteful, consume massive amounts of wood, serve no purpose. He left convinced that Thorson had indeed lost his mind. Grief combined with isolation had produced delusion. The Norwegian was building something that violated every principle of practical cabin construction. By September, Niels had completed his foundation and nothing else. Other trappers were finishing their cabins, preparing for autumn trapping season. Niels had a stone foundation with mysterious interior divisions and no walls. The autumn trapping season was beginning, and he was still laying groundwork. The mockery intensified. Thorson was proving that elaborate thinking produced nothing useful. Simple methods worked because they were efficient. He would finish his monument and discover it provided no advantage over cabins built in a quarter of the time. September arrived, and Niels should have been setting trap lines. Beaver were active in autumn, building winter lodges, and this was prime season for taking pelts while fur quality was high. Instead, Niels spent his days in the forest, examining trees with the intensity of a craftsman selecting wood for fine furniture. Standard cabin construction used whatever logs were conveniently available. Trappers cut the nearest suitable trees, usually pine or spruce, trimmed branches, and hauled them to the building site. If logs had taper or irregular shape, you simply adjusted. Gaps between logs were inevitable and expected. Chinking filled those gaps adequately. Niels rejected this approach entirely. He wanted logs of specific dimensions, uniform diameter from end to end, as straight as possible. He walked miles searching for suitable trees, examining dozens before selecting one. Each chosen tree met strict criteria: 12 inches in diameter, minimal taper, straight grain, no significant knots or irregularities. He cut trees from scattered locations across several square miles, hauling each one back to his building site. Torsten Muller encountered him one afternoon, struggling to drag a log from nearly 2 miles away. Torsten stared in disbelief. "There's perfectly good trees 50 yards from your cabin site. Why are you hauling that from way out here?" Niels paused to catch his breath. "Not straight enough near the cabin. This one is." Torsten shook his head and rode on. Later, at Bjorn's camp, he reported the observation. "Thorson's selecting logs like he's building a church, dragging them from miles away when there's timber right at hand." Man's lost all sense. The log preparation was equally obsessive. Standard practice left bark on logs. It provided minor additional insulation and saved time. Bark compressed and rotted eventually, but cabins were temporary structures. You rebuilt every few years anyway. Niels stripped every log completely, using his draw knife to remove all bark and shape the wood surface. Each log required hours of work, but the result was a perfectly round, uniform cylinder. The pile of prepared logs grew slowly through September and into October. Niels worked alone, methodically, refusing to rush. Other trappers had finished their cabins weeks earlier and were running full trap lines, taking advantage of prime season. Niels was still preparing materials. The economic cost was substantial. Every day spent on construction was a day not trapping, money not earned. By mid-October, first snow fell. Niels had perhaps 50 logs prepared and nothing assembled. A traditional cabin required 40 to 50 logs total and could be raised in 2 days once materials were ready. But Niels still hadn't begun raising walls. He was still in the forest, still selecting, still stripping bark, still shaping wood to precise dimensions. The community consensus was clear. Thorson had wasted the entire season on a project that would likely never be completed. He would face winter in an unfinished structure, consequence of overthinking what should be simple work. Late October brought colder weather, and Niels finally began construction, but not in any way that made sense to traditional cabin building. Standard practice was to raise walls first, then add a chimney once the structure was enclosed. Niels did the opposite. He started with chimneys, building them before any walls existed. He constructed 6 separate stone flues rising from the foundation chambers he had built in August. Each flue was 8 inches square, built from river stones carefully selected for flat surfaces. He mixed clay with horsehair, creating mortar that bound the stones. The horsehair prevented cracking as the clay dried, creating flexible joints that could withstand temperature changes without failing. Each of the 6 flues rose vertically from its foundation chamber, positioned at specific locations. 2 near the front of where walls would eventually stand, 2 at the rear, 2 in the middle positions. They did not connect to each other. Each was an independent channel, a separate pathway for smoke and heat to travel upward. Bjorn Carlson visited in early November and stood staring at the scene. 6 stone columns rising from a foundation, no walls, no roof, just chimneys standing alone like some kind of monument. "What in God's name are you building?" he finally asked. Niels continued mortaring stones. "Chimney system." Bjorn walked around the structures, examining them from different angles. "That's 6 chimneys for a cabin that'll be smaller than mine with 1 chimney. You're wasting stone and time." Niels said nothing, focusing on his work. Each stone had to be positioned correctly, mortar applied evenly, joints checked for stability. The flues had to be perfectly vertical, which he verified constantly using a plumb line, a weight on a string that showed true vertical. Any deviation would affect how smoke drew upward. The precision of the work was unusual. Most trappers built chimneys quickly, knowing they would last a few years before needing repair or replacement. Niels built as if creating permanent structures. Each stone selected for optimal fit, each joint carefully formed, each section checked and rechecked before proceeding to the next level. The clay horsehair mixture itself drew mockery. Bjorn examined it and laughed. "Making fancy pottery now? Plain mud works fine for chinking." But plain mud cracked and fell out within months. Niels had observed chimneys at other camps, seen the failures, noted how mortar deteriorated. His mixture would remain flexible, resist cracking from heat and cold cycles, maintain its seal for years. The horsehair was not decoration, it was structural reinforcement. By mid-November, the 6 flues stood 8 feet tall, rising from the foundation like stone pillars. Snow fell regularly now, and Niels worked in freezing conditions, his hands numb, breath visible in cold air. Other trappers were warm in finished cabins, running trap lines, earning money. Niels was still building, still working on a structure that remained incomprehensible. Word spread through the scattered trapping community. Thorson's building some kind of monument, 6 chimneys and no walls. Claims it's a cabin, but looks like a stone garden. The man's completely lost his mind. Grief does strange things. He'll freeze before he finishes whatever that thing is supposed to be. Torsten Mueller reported to others that Thorson was burning through his money and time on a project with no clear purpose. "I give him until January before he admits defeat and moves into someone else's cabin for the winter." Late November brought the next phase that made Niels's approach even stranger to observers. He began raising walls, but they wrapped around the existing stone flues rather than being built first with chimneys added later. Each log had to be notched and shaped to fit against the stone channels, creating an integrated structure where walls and chimneys formed a single unit. The logs he had spent weeks selecting and preparing now proved their purpose. Because each was uniform in diameter, they stacked with minimal gaps. Standard logs with irregular taper created spaces between them that required heavy chinking. Niels's logs fit together so tightly that chinking served only to seal minor imperfections, not to fill large voids. The chinking mixture was his clay horsehair pine resin compound, which had taken 3 days to prepare. He boiled pine sap collected from trees, reducing it to thick resin. Mixed with clay and horsehair, it created a material that was waterproof, flexible, and incredibly adhesive. He applied it warm, packing it between logs where it bonded to the wood surfaces. Bjorn visited again in early December and watched Niels work. "You're spending more time on chinking than I spent on my entire cabin. That mixture probably cost more than my whole chimney." Niels pressed the compound carefully into each gap. "Your chimney will need repair next spring. This won't." Bjorn had no response to that. It was true that his chimney, built quickly with plain mud mortar, already showed cracks after one winter. He rechunked it every spring. But that was normal. Cabins required maintenance. Niels was building as if he planned to never touch it again. As the walls rose, the 6 stone flues remained visible, extending upward through the structure. At 8 feet, where the walls reached roof height, the flues continued another 18 inches above the planned roof line. This was necessary to create proper draft and prevent smoke from being blown back down by wind. But it meant the roof structure would have to accommodate 6 separate penetrations. Niels built the roof framing with the same precision he had applied to everything else. Each beam was notched to fit around the chimney channels. The spacing had to be exact. The structure had to support the weight of the roof while allowing the flues to pass through without restriction. Traditional single chimney cabins had 1 penetration to manage. Niels had 6, each requiring careful carpentry. Snow accumulated as he worked. Other trappers had been warm in finished cabins for weeks. Niels worked in conditions that would have stopped most men, his determination incomprehensible to observers. Why suffer through this extended construction when a perfectly adequate cabin could have been finished in September? By mid-December, the roof was complete. The structure was finally enclosed. But the 6 stone flues protruding through the roof created an appearance unlike any cabin in the territory. It looked industrial, strange, wrong. And Niels was not finished. The most mocked element was still to come. Torsten Mueller saw the completed roof and shook his head. All that work, and it just looks odd, functions the same as any cabin, but took 3 times as long to build. He was wrong about the function, but he would not learn that until later. The element that would draw the most intense mockery came next. With the cabin enclosed and the 6 stone flues protruding through the roof, Niels began building wooden structures around each chimney, cylindrical casings made from carefully shaped planks, 3 feet tall, 16 inches in diameter, surrounding but not touching the stone flues beneath. He built each casing with precision joinery, planks fitted edge to edge, creating cylinders that were structurally sound. The critical detail was the gap. 4 inches of airspace separated the wooden exterior from the stone flue interior. The casing was open at the bottom where it met the roof and ventilated near the top with small openings just below the rim. Bjorn Carlson arrived as Niels was constructing the 3rd casing. He stared in silence for a full minute before speaking. "You're wrapping your chimneys in firewood, that's what you're doing, building wooden structures around stone chimneys. You know what happens when wood gets near fire?" Niels continued working. "There's a 4-inch air gap. The wood never touches the stone. Heat radiates into the gap, warms the air, but doesn't reach temperatures that would ignite wood. Bjorn's expression suggested he was listening to a madman explain impossible physics. "That wood will catch fire the first cold night you light your stove. I'm telling you this because I don't want to find you burned to death in spring." The concern was genuine, but the conclusion was wrong. Niels understood heat radiation, convection, the behavior of air gaps as insulators. The wooden casings would capture heat radiating from the stone flues, heat that would otherwise escape directly into cold atmosphere. That captured heat would warm the wood, but the air gap prevented temperatures from reaching ignition point. The system would make the cabin more efficient, recovering waste heat. But explaining thermal physics to a man who built by tradition and instinct was pointless. Bjorn would believe the evidence of his eyes, or he would not. Words would not convince him. Torsten Muller heard about the wooden chimney casings and rode over specifically to see them. His assessment was immediate. "Thorsen's building wooden chimneys, going to burn himself alive. Someone should stop him before he kills himself." The word spread rapidly through the trapping community. The crazy Norwegian had spent 4 months building an elaborate cabin, and now he was wrapping the chimneys in wood. The structure would burn within days of him lighting the first fire. Some trappers speculated he had gone completely insane. Others suggested intervention, perhaps forcibly preventing him from occupying the cabin until he came to his senses. Niels ignored all of it. He completed all 6 wooden casings by late December. The final step was adding the iron bands he had purchased in July. Each band fit around the top of a wooden casing, secured with square-cut nails driven through pre-drilled holes. The bands served multiple purposes: structural reinforcement preventing the wood from warping, spark arrestor preventing embers from escaping, and weather seal protecting the gap between wood and stone from rain infiltration. The completed cabin was unlike anything in the territory. 6 wooden cylinders protruding from the roof, each topped with an iron band. It looked strange, industrial, wrong. December 23, 1841, marked the day Niels completed construction and could finally reveal what 4 months of obsessive work had created. The interior layout was as unconventional as the exterior appearance. Where traditional trapper cabins were simple single rooms with a fire pit or a basic fireplace, Niels had created a structure with 3 distinct vertical zones, each serving different purposes. The ground level consisted of the 6 fire chambers he had built into the foundation. Each chamber was approximately 2 feet square, separated from its neighbors by stone walls, each connected to one of the 6 stone flues that rose through the structure. These were not meant to hold large fires. They were designed for small, controlled burns that would generate smoke and moderate heat rather than intense flames. The middle level, where Niels would actually live, occupied the main cabin space at normal floor height. Here he had installed heavy wooden racks suspended from the ceiling beams. These were not furniture that could be moved. They were structural elements built into the architecture itself, designed to support hundreds of pounds of weight. The racks were positioned so that smoke rising from the ground-level fires would circulate around them before continuing upward to the flues. The upper level, in the space just below the roof, was where smoke would concentrate most heavily. This zone would be uninhabitable for a person, but ideal for the final stages of meat curing. The warmest, smokiest air would naturally rise to this level, creating perfect conditions for preservation. At the base of each stone flue, Niels had installed dampers. These were simple metal plates that could be slid into position to partially or completely block airflow. By adjusting these dampers, he could control which flues drew actively and which remained dormant. Opening dampers on flues 1, 3, and 5 would create one pattern of heat and smoke circulation. Opening dampers 2, 4, and 6 would create a different pattern. The system allowed him to direct heat and smoke exactly where needed. The door was solid and well-fitted, designed to seal tightly and prevent drafts. One small window provided light, but was positioned high on the wall and covered with oiled hide. These were standard features, but in Niels's design they served an additional purpose. By minimizing air leaks, he could control exactly how air moved through the structure. Fresh air would enter through deliberate vents at ground level, flow through the fire chambers, rise past the meat racks, and exit through whichever flues he chose to open. He had built gun ports at strategic locations, narrow slits in the walls, invisible from outside, but wide enough to aim a rifle through. These served no purpose for the heating and curing system, but they addressed the lesson from Rolf's death. If threats approached, he could defend without opening the door or exposing himself. A sleeping platform raised 2 feet off the ground gave him a place to rest while providing storage space beneath for supplies, ammunition, trapping equipment. A small work table occupied one corner. Shelves mounted high on walls held food stores, tools, items that needed to stay dry and protected. The entire interior was designed around smoke circulation and heat management. Every element served the dual purposes of providing living space and preserving food. It was not a cabin with a smokehouse attached. It was a single integrated structure where both functions occurred simultaneously in the same space. December 26, 1841, Niels lit his first test fire. He did not start all 6 chambers burning simultaneously. That would have been reckless, testing an unproven system at full capacity. Instead, he placed small amounts of dry kindling in Chamber 1, lit it, and watched what happened. Smoke rose from the kindling, entering the stone flue above the chamber. The flue drew well, pulling smoke upward. Niels climbed onto the roof and observed smoke exiting through the first wooden casing. He placed his hand on the wooden exterior, monitoring temperature. After 10 minutes, the wood was warm but not hot. After 30 minutes, noticeably warm, but still well below any temperature that might cause concern. After an hour, the wood had reached a stable temperature, warm to the touch, but nowhere near combustion range. The air gap was working exactly as he had calculated. Heat radiated from the stone flue into the gap, warming the air trapped there. That warmed air rose and vented through the small openings near the top of the wooden casing. The wood itself absorbed some heat and radiated it back into the cabin space, but the gap prevented direct heat transfer that would make the wood dangerously hot. Over the next 3 days, Niels tested each flue individually. He learned their characteristics. Flue 3 drew strongest, probably due to its position relative to prevailing winds. Flue 5 drew weakest and needed the damper fully open to function well. Each had personality, quirks, behaviors that he noted and filed away for future reference. On December 30th, he tested multiple fires simultaneously. Chambers 1, 3, and 5 burning together. The system handled it without difficulty. Smoke from 3 sources rose through 3 flues, never backing up, never creating dangerous conditions. The wooden casings all remained at safe temperatures. Inside the cabin, the heat from 3 fires was substantial but not overwhelming. He hung his first meat racks on January 2, 1842. Venison from a deer he had taken in late December, butchered into strips suitable for smoking. He arranged the meat on the wooden racks suspended from the ceiling beams, then adjusted his fires and dampers to create the smoke pattern he wanted. For proper cold smoking, meat needed to be exposed to smoke at temperatures between 85 and 110 degrees. Too cool and preservation would be inadequate. Too hot, and the meat would cook rather than cure. Niels used 3 fires burning low in chambers 2, 4, and 6. The smoke rose around the meat racks, concentrated in the upper cabin zone, and exited through the 3 active flues. He monitored the temperature constantly for the first 2 days, adjusting dampers and fire sizes until he achieved stable conditions. By January 4th, he had established a reliable pattern. The meat hung in dense smoke, curing properly, while he lived comfortably in the lower cabin zone where smoke was present but not choking. After 1 week, something else became visible. The snow around his cabin had melted. Not completely, but in a border roughly 10 feet wide encircling the structure, the ground was clear and grass was visible. The distributed heat from 6 wooden-cased chimneys was radiating outward, warming the immediate area enough to create a microclimate. This was waste heat being recovered and used rather than simply vanishing into cold air. By mid-January of 1842, Niels had been living in his completed cabin for 3 weeks. The system was working beyond even his expectations. The interior racks now held 3 full elk, multiple deer, and strings of fish he had caught through ice on the creek. Months of food supply accumulated while he simultaneously maintained comfortable living conditions. His firewood consumption was less than he had calculated. 3 small fires burning continuously used less wood than the single large fire a traditional cabin required. The heat recovery through the wooden casings meant that warmth generated for smoking was not wasted. It circulated through the cabin space before exiting, serving dual purposes. The temperature zones had established themselves naturally. Ground level, where the fire chambers burned, stayed around 70 degrees. The middle level, where he slept and worked, remained at 65 degrees. The upper level, where meat cured, reached 90 degrees due to concentrated smoke and heat rising. These temperatures remained stable regardless of outside conditions. When blizzards dropped the temperature to 20 below zero, his cabin maintained its internal zones with only minor adjustments to fire management. Bjorn Carlson visited on January 15th, ostensibly to check if Niels had survived. He found him comfortable, warm, and surrounded by curing meat. Bjorn stood in the doorway staring at the interior racks loaded with food. "How much meat you got hanging in here?" Niels estimated. 400 pounds, maybe more. "Still have room for another 200. Bjorn entered and walked around the cabin, examining the system he had predicted would fail. Catastrophically. The wooden chimney casings had not burned. The cabin had not filled with choking smoke. The fires burned steadily in their chambers, producing the exact conditions needed for both heating and curing. Outside, Bjorn noticed the green grass border. "How is your ground not frozen? There's 3 feet of snow everywhere except right around your cabin." Niels explained the heat recovery system, how the wooden casings captured radiant heat and redirected it. Bjorn listened but said little. His own cabin, built in the traditional single-chimney style, struggled with the competing demands of heating and food preservation. He maintained a separate smokehouse, spending hours each day managing 2 structures. He burned more wood than Niels, but achieved less efficient results. Bjorn's meat stores were adequate, but required constant attention. He had to choose daily whether to prioritize cabin heat or smokehouse temperature. Too often, he compromised on both, ending up with a cold cabin and inadequately smoked meat. Seeing Niels achieve both goals simultaneously in a single integrated structure challenged everything Bjorn had accepted as frontier truth. Bjorn left without admitting Niels might be right, but he stopped making jokes about wooden chimneys. Word spread through his silence. Thorson's cabin had not burned down. More significantly, it appeared to be working exactly as he claimed it would. Torsten Muller visited in late January with similar results. He arrived skeptical and left puzzled. His own system of separate cabin and smokehouse required twice the work for similar output. Watching Niels live comfortably while meat cured around him demonstrated that accepted limitations might not be limitations at all, just accepted practices that no one had questioned. February of 1842 brought weather that tested every structure in the territory. A severe freeze-thaw cycle hit with temperatures swinging from 20 below zero to 40 above within 3 days. The rapid expansion and contraction stressed materials in ways that normal cold weather did not. Stone cracked. Wood warped. Structures built quickly without attention to thermal movement began failing. Axel Dagmar's cabin had a traditional single stone chimney built the previous spring using standard methods. River rocks mortared with plain clay mud constructed in 2 days, adequate for its purpose. The chimney had functioned well through one winter. But the February temperature swings created stresses the structure could not withstand. On February 19th, cracks appeared in the chimney's mortar. By afternoon, entire sections of stone had loosened. That evening, the upper portion collapsed. Stones and clay tumbled onto the roof, crashed through in places, and filled Oxel's cabin with debris and freezing air. He escaped injury only because he was outside checking his trap lines when the collapse occurred. He arrived at Niels's cabin the next morning, shaken and asking for temporary shelter. Niels took him in and gave him space to sleep while they discussed options. Oxel examined the 6-chimney system with new attention. "How are yours not cracking? That freeze-thaw should have destroyed the mortar." Niels explained that the wooden casings protected the stone flues from direct weather exposure. The rapid temperature changes that had stressed Oxel's exposed chimney never reached Niels's stonework. The air gap provided insulation, buffering the flues from extreme swings. Additionally, the clay horsehair mixture he used for mortar was flexible enough to accommodate minor expansion and contraction without cracking. Oxel spent 3 days at the cabin observing the system operate. He asked detailed questions about construction methods, materials costs, time investment. He watched how Niels adjusted dampers to control heat and smoke distribution. He saw the abundant cured meat, the comfortable living conditions, the stable temperatures maintained regardless of outside weather. On the 3rd day, Oxel admitted what few trappers would say aloud. "I mocked this cabin, called it Thorson's folly, told others you had wasted your time and money. I was completely wrong." Niels appreciated the honesty but offered no judgment. "Traditional methods work adequately for most men. This works better for my needs." Oxel returned to his damaged cabin and began rebuilding. He did not attempt to replicate Niels's 6-flue system exactly. He lacked the materials, time, and perhaps the skill for such complexity, but he incorporated principles he had learned. He built 3 flues instead of 1, used better mortar, created basic heat recovery. His rebuilt cabin was not as sophisticated as Niels's, but was substantially better than what he had before. Word of the collapse spread quickly. Dagmar's chimney failed, while Thorson 6 stood firm. The detail about wooden casings protecting stone flues from weather damage reached every camp in the territory. Men who had dismissed the wooden casings as foolish decoration began reconsidering. Perhaps they served actual engineering purposes. Bjorn visited it again in late February, examining the wooden casings with new attention. "So the wood protects the stone, not just waste lumber," Niels confirmed. "Everything serves multiple purposes: protection, heat recovery, draft control." Bjorn said nothing more, but his expression suggested reassessment of previous judgments. March of 1842 brought early spring thaw and the problem every trapper with winter meat stores eventually faced: temperature management during unpredictable weather. Warm days alternated with cold nights. Cabin interiors fluctuated between too hot and too cold. Meat hanging in these variable conditions risked spoilage if temperatures rose too high or remained inconsistent. Bjorn Carlson faced exactly this challenge. His single chimney cabin required a fire large enough to heat the living space comfortably. During cold March nights, he burned substantial wood and woke to a warm cabin. During warm March days, he reduced the fire or let it die entirely to prevent overheating. His meat stores hung in the cabin, exposed to these temperature swings. For a week, temperatures varied wildly. Bjorn managed as well as any trapper could, adjusting his fire constantly, trying to maintain stability. But meat curing required consistent conditions. The repeated cycling between warm and cool created ideal circumstances for spoilage. Bacteria that remained dormant in stable cold smoke became active when temperatures rose, then survived when temperatures dropped again. On March 12th, Bjorn discovered that his primary elk meat supply had spoiled. 6 months of carefully preserved food, ruined by 1 week of weather he could not control. The loss represented not just meat, but security. Those stores were meant to carry him through spring until fresh game became abundant. Now he faced potential shortage. He walked to Niels's cabin carrying a piece of the spoiled meat as evidence of his failure. He found Niels pulling another rack of perfectly cured elk from the upper cabin zone. The contrast was absolute and undeniable. Bjorn had lost everything. Niels had abundance. "How do you keep the temperature steady?" Bjorn asked. No mockery remained in his voice, only genuine need to understand. Niels explained the damper system. During warm days, he closed the heat-focused flues entirely and opened only the smoking flues. The meat stayed in the cool smoke zone regardless of outside temperature. During cold nights, he opened heat flues to warm the living space, but kept smoking flues operating independently. The meat never experienced temperature swings because the zones were separately controlled. Bjorn spent the entire day examining the system, taking notes with a pencil stub on birch bark. He asked about construction details, material sources, time requirements, costs. He wanted to understand not just what Niels had built, but how to replicate it. Niels walked him through every aspect. The foundation chambers, the separate flues, the air gaps in the wooden casings, the damper controls, the internal rack positioning. He shared information freely, holding back nothing. If Bjorn wanted to build a similar system, Niels would help him understand how. As Bjorn prepared to leave, he said something that marked a turning point. "I called you crazy. Told everyone you would burn alive in that wooden chimney death trap. I was wrong about everything. This is the best-built cabin in the territory, and I was too stupid to see it." Niels accepted the apology without triumph. "You worked with what you knew. Now you know something different." Bjorn left with plans to rebuild his cabin entirely, incorporating a modified multi-flue design. He lacked some materials and would simplify the system, but the core principles were sound and he would apply them. Spring of 1842 brought the end of trapping season and the annual migration of mountain men to settlements and trading posts to sell furs. This was when news spread, stories were shared, and innovations became known across distances too great for regular communication. Lars Anderson, the traveling trader who had noted Niels's unusual supply purchases the previous summer, had visited multiple camps throughout winter, including Niels's. He had seen the six-chimney cabin, observed it functioning, heard the stories of Bjorn's spoilage and Axel's chimney collapse. When Lars reached the trading posts in April, he carried information more valuable than the furs he transported. In Gunnar Ekelund's trading post, trappers gathered to sell their season's take and hear news from other territories. Lars told the story of what he called the smoke room cabin. 6 chimneys with wooden casings, green grass in winter, meat curing and cabin heating happening simultaneously in one structure. Most listeners were skeptical. 6 chimneys sounds like exaggeration, one trapper said. You probably saw 2 or 3, and the story grew. But Lars was specific. I counted them, 6 separate flues. I watched the system work. Thorsson's got 400 pounds of cured meat hanging in his living space while he sleeps there comfortably. I've never seen anything like it. Trappers who had struggled with meat preservation or lost stores to spoilage listened more carefully. The standard methods worked adequately most years, but failed regularly enough that any improvement was worth considering. A few asked Lars for details about location, about whether Thorsson would share his methods. Oscar Nilsson, an experienced trapper from a different territory who had been working the mountain streams for 9 years, paid particular attention. He had been trying to solve the heating-curing problem for years. Every winter he managed separate structures, burned excessive firewood, worked himself near exhaustion maintaining both systems. If someone had actually solved this, he needed to know how. In July, Oscar traveled specifically to find Niels's cabin. The journey took him 3 days out of his way, but the information was worth the effort. He arrived, introduced himself, and asked permission to study the structure. Niels agreed and spent a week showing Oscar every detail. Oscar took extensive notes, drew sketches, measured dimensions, asked hundreds of questions. He examined the foundation chambers, traced smoke flow through the flues, tested the wooden casing temperatures, studied the damper controls. By the end of the week, he understood the principles well enough to adapt them. "Can I build my own version?" Oscar asked. "I will not copy exactly, but I want to use your ideas." Niels had no objection. "The design is not mine to keep. If it helps you survive, build it." Oscar returned to his territory and spent August and September constructing a 5-flue cabin based on Niels's principles. His version was simpler, used different materials, in places adapted to what was available. But the core concept remained: multiple flues for independent heat and smoke control, integrated meat storage, efficient use of generated warmth. Winter of 1843 marked a turning point in how the multi-flue cabin design was perceived across the northern Rocky Mountain trapping territories. 3 cabins now operated using variations of Niels's principles: his original 6-flue structure, Bjorn's rebuilt 4-flue version, and Oscar's 5-flue adaptation. All 3 trappers survived the winter with abundant cured meat and comfortable living conditions, while many traditional single-chimney cabins struggled with the usual problems. Torsten Müller, who had been among the most vocal skeptics, finally conceded that perhaps Niels had discovered something valuable. In spring of 1844, Torsten began planning his own multi-flue cabin. He visited Niels twice that summer to study construction details and ask questions about materials. By autumn, he had completed a 4-flue version that incorporated wooden casings and independent damper controls. The technique spread through demonstration rather than promotion. Niels never advertised his design or claimed superiority over traditional methods. He simply lived in his cabin, trapped his territory, and shared information freely when asked. But results spoke more effectively than any argument could have. Trappers who adopted the multi-flue design consistently reported better meat preservation, lower firewood consumption, and more comfortable living conditions. Each builder modified the core concept based on available materials, personal skill level, and specific needs. Some built 3 flues, others 5. A few attempted 6, like Niels's original. Some used wooden casings for heat recovery. Others developed different methods to capture waste heat. Some incorporated elaborate damper systems. Others used simpler controls. The variations were endless, but common elements persisted: multiple independent flues, integrated meat storage, and systems designed to serve dual heating and curing purposes. By 1845, an estimated 8 to 10 cabins in the region operated using multi-flue principles. This represented perhaps 5% of trappers in the territory. Traditional single-chimney construction remained dominant, preferred for its simplicity and speed. But the multi-flue design had established itself as a legitimate alternative for those willing to invest the additional construction time. The name that had started as mockery became the accepted term. Smokeroom cabins called such because they functioned as integrated living spaces and smokehouses. The phrase appeared in conversations at trading posts, in letters trappers sent to families back east, in the verbal folklore of mountain men swapping stories around fires. Lars Anderson, still traveling between camps buying furs and trading supplies, encountered the design's influence across increasingly wide territories. In 1845, he met trappers 200 miles from Niels's location who asked about that Norwegian's factory cabin with all the chimneys. The story had traveled beyond direct witnesses, becoming frontier legend. Details became exaggerated in retelling. Some accounts claimed 12 chimneys, magical properties that kept bears away, or other embellishments that Niels would have found absurd. But the core truth persisted through the distortions. One trapper had questioned accepted limitations, built something radically different, and proven that heating and curing could happen simultaneously in a single, well-designed structure. Niels continued trapping through 1845. His cabin, now 4 years old, showed minimal deterioration. The wooden casings had weathered but remained functional. The stone flues stood intact with no cracking or collapse. The system operated exactly as designed, requiring only routine maintenance. By 1846, the Rocky Mountain fur trade was collapsing. Beaver populations had been trapped nearly to extinction. More significantly, silk had replaced beaver felt in hat production, destroying demand for pelts that had driven the mountain man era. Men who had spent decades in the wilderness faced reality. The life they knew was ending. Niels Thorsen made his decision in spring of 1846. He was 37 years old, had survived 15 years in the mountains, and had saved enough money to start differently. He sold his trapping territory and cabin to a settler family, packed his possessions, and joined a wagon train heading to Oregon Territory. In Oregon, he bought a small ranch in the Willamette Valley, 40 acres with creek and timber. He built a house using principles learned in mountains: careful material selection, superior construction, attention to details others overlooked. In 1847, he married a widow named Kirsten, who had also come west. They raised 3 children over the following decade. Niels never became famous. He never sought recognition for the cabin design that had changed trappers' lives. He lived quietly, raised cattle and hay, participated in community, and grew old without fanfare. When conversations turned to frontier stories, he rarely mentioned his mountain years. That was a different life left behind when he chose civilization. His original cabin remained standing in Montana, occupied by successive inhabitants through the 1850s. Each new occupant discovered the 6-chimney system worked remarkably well. They maintained it, used it, appreciated its efficiency without knowing the story behind its construction. Traditional cabins from the same era collapsed or required constant repair. The smokeroom cabin simply functioned year after year. By 1855, the cabin had survived 14 winters. Wooden casings showed weathering but no rot. Stone flues stood perfectly vertical with intact as mortar. Internal racks still supported hundreds of pounds of curing meat. The structure demonstrated what careful engineering could achieve in harsh frontier conditions. The multi-flue design continued spreading slowly through the 1850s and 60s. It never became universal. Most settlers built simple single-chimney cabins because they were faster and required less skill. But those who valued efficiency continued discovering the advantages of multiple flues and integrated smoke management. Frontier historians later estimated 15 to 20 cabins were built using variations of Niels's principles between 1841 and 1865. Some stood for decades, becoming local landmarks. A few were preserved into the 20th century as examples of unusual frontier architecture, though most who saw them never learned the story of their origin. Niels Thorsen died in 1873 at his Oregon ranch, age 64, surrounded by family. His obituary mentioned ranching success and community involvement. It said nothing about mountains, trapping, or the cabin that had been mocked then copied. In Montana, his original cabin stood until 1891, when forest fire swept the territory. But the principle endured in other structures, in knowledge passed between builders, in understanding that accepted limitations were sometimes just accepted ignorance, waiting to be challenged by someone willing to try something different.